Well, thanks so much, Tracy. And I am very, very pleased to be here. I've heard so much about these conferences, so I thank Kathy for raising my name. And again, I want to congratulate all the organizers, because I think looking at the agenda, this is an amazing slate of workshops and keynotes. So thank you. Now I just have to get myself, find all my little gadgets here. I'm going to be talking this morning about violence in lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, two-spirit, queer lives. And I'm just going to be shortening that to LGBTQ as I speak this morning. And just so you know, I guess on your USB stick or in your materials, I did provide a glossary of terms where I do define the way in which I'm using that language. So I won't offer definitions in my talk this morning, but I'll just refer you to that in case you're wondering, and I'll get started. And I'm going to share with you some research findings from my own work, and also from the work of others who have been working in this area for the last several years. So there we go. Just to begin, I'd like to start off by reading two quotations. And again, these were from interviews that I conducted with women who had been in abusive relationships with other women. And the first is a quotation from a woman who was speaking about the impact of homophobia and stigma on her relationship. And she was talking about her abusive partner. And she said that her partner was afraid to be outed at work, that she didn't know if she'd lose her job, small town and all. And I asked her, do you think that played into the abuse, that homophobic context? And she said, yes, I think so, because she was upset with me for being so out, so open as a lesbian, because I guess that would reflect back on her, and it would be obvious that she was a lesbian too. And in another quotation, I spoke to a young woman who talked about the aspects of her relationship that she felt were complex, the features that she felt made her marginalized and weren't recognized by anti-violence services. And she said, I feel like I can't talk about it. I mean, how many therapists, service providers are going to understand queer, SM, abuse, intersex, interracial? It's too complicated. There's too much explaining that I'd have to do. And I start with these quotations because I think they very much sort of provide the context of where we're at in terms of understanding and being able to respond to violence in LGBTQ lives. And that first quotation, if I just go back, this was from an interview that was conducted in 2010. And I say that because sometimes there's a feeling that, well, homophobia is not an issue anymore. There's all kinds of rights. Same-sex marriage has been legalized. But depending on where you live, depending on the kind of job you have, depending on your family, there's certainly still a risk, and people certainly do experience being rejected, losing their jobs, not being able to find housing. And so you can see how homophobia becomes a factor then in shaping and informing the abuse dynamics. And similarly, in the quotation from the young woman that I spoke to, she was in a large city with a very visible LGBTQ population and a very active anti-violence movement. And yet she still felt that her experiences were not going to be understood. She couldn't see herself reflected in the services that were being offered. So again, just kind of a reminder that in spite of all the good work that's being done and all the good intentions, there's still work that needs to be done in order for people to feel that they're included, that their lives are being understood and recognized. So I think that's a challenge for all of us. And what I'd like to do today is try to give you a bit of a snapshot or an overview of where we are in terms of understanding LGBTQ relationships. And I would say, just as a kind of quick snapshot to sum it all up, we are at least 20 to 25 years behind what we know in heterosexual domestic violence compared to what we know in LGBTQ violence. 20 to 25 years behind. And that's simply because there aren't that many people doing the work. If you look at the research, there aren't very many researchers who are looking at this. If you look at programs and services, there aren't very many programs and services that have been developed. And I know you know full well some of the challenges and difficulties in terms of lack of funding and limited mandates and political repercussions. But that means that if we address LGBTQ lives, it tends to be added on. So added on to studies, added on to existing programs and frameworks and ways that we understand violence. And that means that sometimes the specifics, the real details and diversity of LGBTQ people's lives are not really being understood. They're not really being looked at because they're just being brought into what we already know about heterosexual domestic violence. That also means that there are many, many, many gaps. We know very little about the experiences of people who identify as trans and queer. There's far more information about people who identify as lesbian or gay. We don't know that much about the impact of different levels of severity of violence or the different types of violence that are being experienced. And so these are areas that are again, why we're about 20 to 25 years behind. So what I'd like to do in my time with you this morning is talk a little bit about what we know, what we need to know, and where we need to go. And so I'll tell you a little bit about some of the studies that have been done to understand the different rates and prevalence of violence. And I'll speak a little bit of, I think, some very important work that's looking at the contexts of where violence occurs, sort of the spaces and places where violence can take shape. Speak a bit about problems that we have with the language we use and the binary categories that we rely on in this field and how people can feel excluded by that. Talk a little bit about barriers and services, and then end with what I see as an ethical challenge, how we might think through different frameworks in order to respond to LGBTQ lives. So I'd like to start with this headline. I don't know how many of you remember seeing this, a national newspaper where there was this headline that said, "A skeleton that's still in the closet. Domestic violence is more widespread among same-sex couples than straights." So I looked at that. You know, on the one hand, you think, whew, a national newspaper, finally giving some attention to this issue. And it was a full two-page spread. But I knew when I read that headline that this was not only sensationalized, but it was wrong. So what was it based on? Well, this was based on the fact that Statistics Canada had just released a report on violent victimization. And for the very first time, Statistics Canada asked people a question where they could identify their sexual orientation. First time in 2004. You'll notice they didn't include a question where people could talk about their gender identity or gender expression, but they were able to talk about sexual orientation. They found, so they surveyed over 23,000 people, and of those 23,000, 356 identified as gay, lesbian, or bisexual. So that's what the headline is based on, the responses of 356 people. And we learned from that survey that gay, lesbians, and bisexuals reported higher rates of violent victimization, things like sexual assault, physical assault, robbery, and discrimination. Now, in some ways, that's not surprising, and I think that confirms a lot of other studies and work that you probably know, that lesbian, gay, bisexual people are often at risk at greater violence on the street, outside of their homes. When they asked about spousal violence, they found that 15% of gay men and lesbians and 28% of bisexuals reported abuse. And that was much higher than 7% of heterosexuals in this sample who reported abuse. So what can we conclude? Well, they certainly do tell us that there were higher rates of violent victimization experienced by gay, lesbian, and bisexual people as individuals. But we cannot say from those statistics that violence in same-sex relationships is more widespread. And do you know why? They didn't ask what kind of relationship people were in where they experienced the violence. Imagine 28% of the respondents were bisexuals, and we don't know if they were talking about violence that occurred within a same-sex or an opposite-sex relationship. Further, they paid no attention to gender. They didn't break down differing experiences for gay men, lesbians, bisexual women, bisexual men. So there was no attention to that, and they just assumed this kind of homogeneous GLB experience. So The reason I get upset about this is because to me it kind of reflects the limitations of this added-on analysis. So on the one hand, Statistics Canada can now say, tick, we include gay, lesbian, bisexual people. But on the other hand, they're not really interrogating or trying to understand what their own statistics mean. They're not really exploring the experiences of gay, lesbian, and bisexual lives in this case. And so we're left with the Globe and Mail making the sensationalized headline of, whoa, they're worse. Not only are they experiencing violence, but they're worse. There are examples, fortunately, of some other studies that I think have done a better job and that point to some important similarities and differences that maybe we need to consider in our work. And these are the results of a study that was done in the U.S., the National Violence Against Women Survey, where they spoke to about 8,000 women and 8,000 men and asked them about their experiences of violence, including intimate partner violence. And when you look at these results, there are some interesting patterns, gendered patterns. So 25% of women who were in heterosexual relationships reported being physically assaulted and raped by their male partners. So that was much higher than women in intimate relationships with other women, who reported about 11% of abuse. And when they looked at men's experiences, 15% of men who were in relationships with other men reported physical and sexual assault, compared to 7.7% of men who were in relationships with women reported abuse by their female partners. So I mention this because I think these kinds of details are important. They speak to perhaps different kinds of gendered patterns of abuse that we need to pay attention to, and that might determine how we should respond, or might help us determine what kind of programs we need to offer to intervene and stop violence. And more recently, this was a study done in the UK where they also compared the experiences of heterosexual respondents and same-sex respondents. And they found some interesting similarities. They found in their surveys that those in the younger age bracket of 20 to 25 years are more likely to experience domestic violence. And again, that might not be surprising to you, but it suggests that if we know that that's a vulnerable age group, we should be doing some interventions that address the vulnerability of those in that age group. They also found that post-separation abuse was common. So it was experienced by lesbians and gay men at rates similar to what heterosexual women experience. They also found, I think, some interesting differences that, again, require more work, more research, more attention. They found that lesbian, gay, and bisexual respondents reported more emotional and sexual abuse than physical abuse. And they also found that gay and bisexual men were more likely to report sexual assault, including things like being forced into sexual activity, being hurt during sex, or being threatened with sexual assault. So again, I think these differences are important for us to get inside and to try to understand as we think about how we want to respond and develop programs to stop violence. Other studies that I'll mention have looked more specifically at the experiences of LGBTQ people. So they're not trying to compare the results to results on heterosexual domestic violence. And we know from this research, and again, I'm sure this is something that would confirm your experience, that the same range and forms of violence exist in LGBTQ relationships as in heterosexual relationships, but that there are different threats or tactics that can be used to help maintain power and control in a relationship. So threatening to out someone, out them based on their gender identity, sexual orientation, is a very, very powerful threat. And the fact that our relationships are still sometimes stigmatized, that serves as another threat. So you can reinforce somebody's fears that they're not going to be loved, that their family might reject them, that nobody else is going to care about them because they're queer. Powerful, powerful tools. I think what's also important is, again, to think about language. And in my own research, I became very aware of how some of the language and terms that we use in the field of domestic violence gets understood as only applying to heterosexuals. And this was an example of a woman that I interviewed who was speaking to me about her experiences where if I had asked her straight out and said, "Were you sexually assaulted?" she would have said no. But in the course of the interview, when she explained the behaviors of her abusive partner, and I said, would she be forcing you to have sex? She then said, oh, there's something. Now, I never thought about it in that way. So it was the process of her telling the story and me asking the question in a different way that allowed her to then see that, yes, in fact, she had experienced sexual coercion and sexual assault. But if I had started with the category or the term, she would have said no. So research is really reminding us that we have to be aware of the assumptions that are in the language that we have and try to find other ways of asking questions. Other research that I want to explore are some small studies, but I think important studies that have been done that really look at, again, where violence occurs and how violence is linked to structural inequalities and how violence is linked to other conditions that help shape and form experiences. And the reason I think this is important is because it does give us some hope about being able to think about how we might change conditions, work towards social change, and end violence. But several studies have now found a pattern where LGBTQ people are reporting experiencing violence in the context of their very first relationship. Okay? And in some ways, that might not be, again, surprising. You think about coming out. If you look at our school curriculum, there's still so little that might talk or even address the lives of LGBTQ people. There's no information about things like dating. Where do people go who are identifying as lesbian, gay, or trans? Where do you go to meet other people? How are you going to find that first connection? And so that kind of context of a first relationship is one where there can be greater vulnerability and isolation. And there's a quotation there from a study done by Nicola Brown, who interviewed sexual minority women who were in relationships with trans men and who had experienced abuse. And as this woman said, she couldn't tell anybody about the abuse that was going on in her relationship because she was still trying to explain the whole context of her relationship, that it was okay to be trans. And so that layer made it very difficult for her to get any kind of support or response to the abuse that she experienced. So unlike heterosexual relationships, first LGBTQ relationships, I think, are often a confirmation for the first time of your sexual identity and your sense of self. So again, if you don't see yourself reflected, if you're in a family where there's no discussion or acknowledgement of being lesbian, gay, or bisexual, then sometimes being in that first relationship is the first time that you're able to say to yourself, yeah, this is who I am. And so then that means that you can be at risk. You're maybe not confident about what's acceptable in a relationship if you don't see relationships portrayed, and if you're with an abusive partner who's telling you that same-sex relationships are different than heterosexual relationships. So there can be different dependency issues if your abusive partner has been out longer and if that partner is connected to social networks that you're not connected to. So a very important context to think about violence is occurring in somebody's very first relationship. So what might we do in terms of not only intervention but prevention, given that we know this to be a pattern? Similarly, we know from other research that violence often occurs within a context of living with a stigmatized chronic illness like HIV. And so there's been some very important work looking at the experiences of gay men who are HIV positive. And one study found that 60% of men who are HIV positive said that they decided to stay in an abusive relationship because they were afraid of dying alone. Very powerful. Other studies have talked about how both partners who might both be living with HIV are dependent on each other for finances, for housing. And so that can create a context where it becomes difficult to leave a relationship or to seek any kind of help. If the person who's HIV positive is the abuser, the person who's caring for that person who's being victimized may not want to go to the police because they'll feel like they're betraying this partner that they're caring for. So complex dynamics that get created because of living with a stigmatized illness. Another more recent study looked in particular at the experiences of sexual minority men of color, and I think this is important because they identified a triangle of risk, which included experiences of childhood trauma, so either experiencing violence or witnessing violence in your home or in your community, using substances, often to cope with trauma, sometimes to cope with mental illness, and then structural factors, in particular poverty, that those three risk factors became important because they often were the pathway to acquiring HIV and entering into relationships where there was violence. So again, really important, if we know that those are some of the spaces and places where violence occurs, how can we change some of those factors that set up these conditions? Similarly, I recently was able to be involved in a study with Art Zokol from Two-Spirited People of the First Nations. And this was a small study where we interviewed Aboriginal Two-Spirit LGBTQ people about their experiences of movement. And we did this study both in Winnipeg and in Vancouver. And people were talking to us about moving many, many times in their lives. And in this small study, 24 of the 49 people that we spoke to said that they felt forced out of their community because of their sexual or transgender identity. And then that led them to move, usually to larger urban centers in search of an LGBTQ community, where they often experienced racism, and 42 out of 49 reported then entering into a relationship where there was same-sex violence. So again, that context of mobility and that dislocation that's caused from that movement is a situation that creates and helps to sustain and maintain violence. So I think in doing this work, when we're looking at violence in LGBTQ lives, it becomes really important to recognize that larger backdrop of violence and oppression that many LGBTQ people experience. And I think again, we need to think about how we might reflect that in some of the services and programs that we develop. But we know that LGBTQ people often experience both hate crimes and intimate partner violence. And I've just put up a few figures there of how common that is. We know, for example, that many lesbian and bisexual women have also experienced male violence. And 60% of transgender people have been victimized by hate violence. So that's huge. Those are high, high figures. I think what's also important to consider is just when, or given the theme of safety, where do people experience safety? So if we know that there are these high rates of violence on the street, and we know that people are experiencing violence within their homes, where do people feel safe? And recently, EGAL Canada did a survey on school climate, and again, the figures are quite discouraging and quite depressing, but it suggests that schools are certainly not safe places for LGBTQ people. 70% of students hear the phrase, "that's so gay," every day in school, and "that's so gay" is not being used in a good way. 46% also hear the term faggot every single day, most often with no intervention from teachers or other leaders in the school. And again, if you just look at those numbers of the high degrees of harassment because of gender expression, non-conforming gender expression, also, 49% of trans, 40% of gay male, and 33% of lesbians reported being sexually harassed or sexually assaulted just in the past year. So we have to ask, what is the impact of going to school, hearing those phrases, being part of that culture every day? What is the impact of that on LGBTQ lives and on our relationships? And again, how can we change those conditions? Because no doubt the impact is a negative one. And I think we also know, and Terry Swan certainly spoke to this, and that we have to, in doing this work, look more broadly at structural and systemic violence, and that many, many people have had the experience of a lifetime of violence. And I just wanted to share this one quotation with you. This was a woman that I interviewed, and I remember her vividly. She just could speak so clearly about that larger context and the impact on her life. And she talked to me about being abused as a child, about experiencing racism and the effects as an Aboriginal person who grew up in Alberta. She talked about entering the sex trade and being beaten by Johns. And she talked about being abused in a relationship with another woman. And then she talked about entering in another relationship with a woman and then she herself becoming abusive. And this is what she said. As I look back, my mom is physically abusive to me and my brother. I was sexually abused by my grandfather, and that was huge for me. Plus, I'm from Alberta, and there's a lot of racism towards natives, people running people over and not caring. What I seen is what I thought was acceptable. And you know, she spoke to me, she was not offering any excuses. She just knew that larger impact of structural inequalities on her life. And I became so aware of how I was doing such a disservice in asking her to just speak about this one slice of her life in my focus on domestic violence. You know, I was missing so much else that was a part of her story. And then what relationship was I going to focus on? The one where she was now recently abusive, or the one before where she was being abused? So it's just a reminder to me again about how we have to be able to consider that larger context. And if we are just taking a slice, that's an artificial slice that we're creating. So some research has suggested that it becomes very difficult for LGBTQ people to access services, again, because some of the assumptions that we have in the categories that we've created, in some of the binaries, the either or, you're either this or you're that. And of course, the one that is powerful for all of us working in this field is the construct of victim and perpetrator. And yet, when you think about it, the mainstream images or stereotypes of what a victim looks like or what a perpetrator looks like becomes limiting for how people are able to recognize themselves or talk about their stories of abuse. So often the stereotypes mean that if you are a man who's been victimized, you must somehow present as feminine in order for us to believe you that you've really been victimized. Or if you're a female victim, you must somehow present as passive. So there are these constructions then of good passive victim that also reflect racialized and class-based assumptions that make it very hard for people to always see themselves, again, depending on their experiences. And this comes from my own research, where many women that I talked to spoke about experiences that were confusing for them in their relationships because they fought back. And I'm not talking about mutual abuse. I think that's problematic, and that's not what women were describing to me, but they talked about fighting back in different ways. 7 women that I interviewed said that they fought back and they wanted to retaliate. 29 or 23 women said that they fought back in self-defense throughout the relationship. And 9 said that they fought back at the very end of the relationship, usually where they had reached a point in their own mind where they said they felt like there was a turning point or they couldn't take it anymore, and maybe they fought back on 1 or 2 occasions. But they found it difficult to be able to talk about those experiences when the image we have of a victim suggests that you shouldn't fight back. So they were having a difficult time in naming their experiences or being able to talk about the full experience of violence that they occurred because of some of the limitations of our binary categories. And of course, another difficult binary, and one that I'm fully in this morning, is that, I'm talking about same-sex relationships, and yet that's a very problematic kind of phrase because it conflates gender identity and sexual orientation. Just like I'm using LGBTQ, and while it's convenient, there are a lot of diverse experiences. Gay men's experiences are different from people who identify as trans or queer. Bisexual women, again, will have very different set of experiences. And it gets hard to tease that out when we're relying on language partly for convenience. And many activists are rightly saying, how does the T fit within LGBTQ? So all of these kinds of binaries and the language and assumptions have made it very difficult for people to even try to seek help or to get the kind of help that they need to stop the abuse. And we know this research that has addressed barriers in services has actually been going on for some time. And the discouraging thing for me is that the results of the studies don't change. We keep on coming up with the same findings. So we know that LGBTQ people are more likely to turn to counselors or to informal supports than they are to go to any kind of anti-violence service. And we also know that there continues to be very, very few places for gay or bisexual men or trans people to turn to for support. So that means that they're at greater risk of homelessness. And we also know that there continue to be very, very few programs for LGBTQ people who are engaging in abusive behavior. And more likely they are asked to join groups that have been designed for heterosexual men. So these are the barriers that remain, and this pattern hasn't changed over the last 20 years. I do offer some signs of hope. I mean, I think there certainly are services, and certainly services within EVA, that are trying to respond to same-sex and same-gender violence. And this was a recent campaign launched by police in the UK, where they acknowledge that same-sex people are unlikely to turn to the police because they often feel their stories have been minimized or ignored. And so now the police are doing this active campaign to say, we will listen to you, we want you to come and talk to us. At the same time, there's a program in Sydney, Australia that has focused on same-sex domestic violence, but they sometimes have to counter the fact that sometimes then people think that all same-sex relationships are abusive. And so for Valentine's Day, they launched a campaign to, again, just promote the fact that LGBTQ relationships are diverse, healthy, happy, just to counter their own service. So I've provided you with quite a broad overview in terms of where we are in the field, and I've tried to raise some of the complexities and challenges, but I think that leaves us with ultimately this ethical challenge. How can we better understand and respond to violence in LGBTQ lives? And I want to go back to the one quotation that I started with and tell you a little bit more about this woman. So this woman who felt like she couldn't go to any service because her relationship was too complex and she didn't think service providers would understand it. So when she spoke to me, she was 21 years of age. She was a university student, and she identified as a queer white woman. She had no family in the city where she was attending university. And the relationship violence that she experienced lasted about 18 months, and it included verbal, emotional, and physical abuse. And she also talked to me about how she had been gay bashed a year earlier. And she said that her marks at school were negatively impacted and that she went through a long period of depression. And she described her partner as being 25 years of age, who was employed, working full-time, and who also identified as queer, intersex, and South Asian. And this woman lived in the city where her family was, and her family was her support network. She had experienced much childhood trauma from her interactions with the healthcare system at an early age because she was intersex. And so she often spoke about that trauma at the hands of medical providers. So how do we hear her story? And if we think through a risk and vulnerability lens, we might focus on some of the individual risk factors that made her vulnerable to violence. Her age, the fact that she was new to the city and had no family support. We might explore issues of low self-esteem and her lack of experience in intimate relationships. And we might also look at individual risk factors for her abusive partner, including her childhood trauma. But what if we work through a lens where gender is our focus? If we think about that, we might focus on her victimization as a woman and that larger pattern of women in that age group in particular being vulnerable to violence in relationships. And that might confirm our very deep understanding of the deeply gendered patterns of violence that are part of a patriarchal culture. And we might focus on the way her partner used power and control in the relationship. And what if we worked through an intersectionality framework? What if we adopted that lens? Well, we might focus on the features of her identity as queer, as a white woman in university, and see how those interlocking systems of both privilege and oppression work to sustain and support violence. We might focus on her experiences of both hate violence and partner violence. And we might also look at how power operated in the relationship as both relational and changing. And finally, what if we worked through a lens that was focused or informed by queer theory or postmodernism, those academic terms that are interested in language and breaking down binaries? We might hear the way her story challenges normative and binary thinking, how her experience is about both and rather than just either or. We'd be mindful of how our language and categories contain certain assumptions. And finally, we might listen to how her story also reveals her resiliency, her agency, and transgressive actions. So I offer these framings not because I think one is better than the other, but I think in order to develop ethical responses, we have to become more aware of the frameworks that we're using, the different lenses that we're putting on that allow us to hear certain features of somebody's story and that might prevent us from fully understanding or hearing other experiences or other aspects of that person's story. And I'm reminded of this quote by Virginia Woolf and think that it may take, in some cases, 50 different pairs of eyes to really see and understand somebody else's experience and story. So I'm going to end by suggesting that what this means for me is that we have to sort of step back and keep on asking ourselves a set of critically reflexive questions. And there aren't easy answers to any of these questions. But if we keep on asking them in our frontline work, in our research, in our policy work, it might make us more accountable and more aware of who we're including and who we might be excluding, and allow us to make the shifts necessary so that we can make our services reflect the diversity of violence in people's lives. So who benefits from the way we talk about domestic violence or talk about sexual assault? Whose voices are heard and whose voices are not heard when we use established categories? Whose results might be blurred and whose needs are not met as a result? And what if we mapped the range of experiences of violence? What if we looked at violence over the lifespan? How might that change our approaches to this work? How might that change our research? And what if we imagined community responses to violence? What if we held communities accountable for violence? What might that look like? And so just to end then, I think in doing work in the field of LGBTQ violence, I think it's also important to just remember that violence in LGBTQ relationships is a political issue that can be used against LGBTQ people. That's still part of the climate that we live in. And that we have to really listen and be able to hear differing experiences and differing contexts in which violence occurs. And that means, to me, resisting the tendency to create that kind of one-size-fits-all response to violence. So how do we imagine new responses, and how can we keep on thinking through multiple frameworks so that we can keep our work rooted in anti-oppression and social justice efforts? And I'll end there, and I thank you for listening this morning.